ago, suggesting that the Bureau had been, quote, tainted.
It's a shame what's happened with the FBI, but we're going to rebuild the FBI. It'll be bigger and better than ever.
Change is taking place. The FBI's general counsel, James Baier, has been reassigned. Deputy Director Andrew McCabe expected to retire early next year. Agent Peter Strzok, who helped to run the Clinton server investigation, has been removed from the Russia probe after anti-Trump texts were discovered in correspondence with his alleged mistress and fellow agent Lisa Page. And former Associate Deputy AG Bruce Orr has been demoted at Justice for concealing meetings with Fusion GPS, the company behind the anti-Trump dossier.
The problem is, in the swamp of Washington, D.C., the biggest alligator is a politicized FBI and Department of Justice. And that's why we're fighting hard to make sure that we've got a fair and equal opportunity for all sides to be heard.
But critics wonder if some of the changes, notably Baker's reassignment, are the result of mounting political pressure from the Trump White House and Republican lawmakers on Capitol Hill. Former FBI Director Jim Comey tweeting, "Sadly, we're now at a point in our political life when anyone can be attacked for partisan gain." Credit to my colleague John Roberts for that letter that we referenced at the very top of the piece. By the way, Nunes says the DOJ and FBI have until January 3rd to respond to all their requests. Of course, that's a date Mike will be watching very carefully on the calendar.
No doubt about that. Kevin Corke leading us off tonight. Kevin, many thanks.
Thank you.
President Trump touts his legislative success from his first year in office as record-breaking and more successful than anybody else. The president is certainly coming off a big win with the first tax reform in more than 3 decades, but a website that tracks total bills says the Trump team has more work to do. Yet when it comes to reversing the policies of the last administration, the president has a laundry list of accomplishments. Correspondent Rich Edson has the story tonight from West Palm Beach.
Much of the progress President Trump cites during his first year in office is reversing Obama administration accomplishments.
We've got a lot of the rules and regulations, and you people suffered from that to a certain extent too, in all fairness. But a lot of the regulations were avoided.
Congress finally delivered the president a major piece of legislation this month, a massive tax cut, after a frustrating year of unsuccessful attempts to replace Obamacare. Last year, voters delivered Republicans the White House, House, and Senate. And the party expected to significantly alter the government after 8 years of the Obama administration.
You know, one of the things that people don't understand, we have signed more legislation than anybody. We broke the record of Harry Truman.
A project called GovTrack says that's false, that President Trump has signed the fewest bills into law by this point in his presidency since at least President Dwight Eisenhower. Though the Trump administration, without Congress, has steadily and effectively dismantled many of President Obama's regulations and executive initiatives. Trump officials have cut subsidies to insurance companies designed to stabilize Obamacare markets, substantially rolled back environmental rules, sought longer sentences for drug offenders, repealed net neutrality rules designed to prevent service providers from interfering with internet traffic, rescinded guidelines on sexual assault at colleges and bathrooms for transgender students, withdrew the United States from a massive trade deal, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and restored some restrictions on Americans traveling to Cuba. President Trump also stopped certifying that Iran is complying with the bulk of the Iran nuclear agreement, though the United States is still adhering to the deal. And with a Republican Senate to confirm nominees, the president has steadily filled judicial vacancies with conservatives. Next year, the president has tasked Congress with immigration, infrastructure, and has asked Republicans and Democrats to develop a new health care plan, though Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says the Senate will probably move on to other issues. Internationally, continued pressure on North Korea. After a South Korean report claimed China illegally provided energy to North Korea, President Trump tweeted this morning, quote, "Caught red-handed. Very disappointed that China is allowing oil to go into North Korea. There will never be a friendly solution to the North Korea problem if this continues to happen." China denies the story. In an op-ed in the New York Times, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson says China has been helpful, but it could and should do more to isolate North Korea. Secretary Tillerson also says the administration will continue to pursue U.S. economic interests with China, intellectual property theft, and addressing that massive trade imbalance between the two countries. Mike?
Rich, this was part of a list of accomplishments Secretary Tillerson detailed in 2017. There's been extensive reporting he is leaving. Is the secretary planning on staying in 2018?
He is, according to State Department officials, Mike. And, you know, the secretary has been at odds with the president on a number of issues, whether it be Iran, North Korea, Qatar. And there is consistent speculation that the president's not happy with him and that he's going to leave in the early part of next year. Though State Department officials insist the secretary is staying and planning international travel well into this winter. Mike.
Rich Edson live in West Palm Beach, Florida. Rich, thanks a lot. The president closes out 2017 with a big legislative win on taxes, but it was not easy. And the road ahead for his next big agenda item could be just as rough. Correspondent Ellison Barber reports on the president's plan for infrastructure.
In an era where partisan divide defines the U.S. Congress, it's one of the few issues where, on the surface, it seems like Republicans and Democrats could find a sliver of agreement and make a deal.
Infrastructure is the easiest of all. We're very well on our way, so we'll be having that done pretty quickly.
And it's not just roads and bridges and potholes, which are in very bad shape, but we should have broadband across this country.
The process for rolling out long-awaited infrastructure reform legislation is set to begin next month when President Trump sits down with fellow GOP leaders in Congress.
The president has already invited Leader McConnell and Speaker Ryan to Camp David the first weekend in January to make sure we're all on the same page about what our priorities are for 2018.
White House officials tell Fox News they are looking at about $200 billion in direct federal spending and easing environmental and labor regulations with the goal of stimulating $1 trillion in public works investment. But there is competing rhetoric within Trump's own party over whether this issue will be a priority in an election year.
What are we going to do in 2018? We're going to pick up where we left off and get back at reforming health care. We're going to get back at reforming these entitlements, and we're going to take on welfare reform.
Some fiscal conservatives are concerned about the cost of transportation reforms. To save taxpayer money, they favor more funding partnerships between the public and private sector. That means things like toll roads. As for Democrats, there's infighting there as well over whether to work with the president and his allies. Some remain frustrated over tax reform and, in their view, being left out of the negotiations, while some on the left are calling Trump out and at times taunting him for not moving faster on an election campaign promise.
No infrastructure bill. Where's that famous infrastructure bill that was going to be the first thing out of the gate?
Democrats have laid out their own competing $1 trillion bill. The money would come mostly from direct federal funding.
We are ready with a strong infrastructure bill that was put on the president's desk in January. We're still waiting to get feedback on that. It would create 15 million jobs.
Unsurprisingly, money paying for a plan to rebuild our roads and rails is the biggest hang-up, at least for now. Current offset proposals include increasing the federal gasoline tax and tax breaks for cities and the private sector so they can fund their own rebuilding projects. Mike?
Ellison Barber live here in Washington. Ellison, thanks very much. For more on the legislative agenda for 2018, I'm joined by House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy, who's back home in California, where he is spending the holidays. Good evening, Majority Leader McCarthy.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
Let's get right to it. What are your legislative priorities for next year?
Well, we got a lot of big legislative priorities. One is infrastructure, focusing on continuing job creation, making sure our troops have everything they need to keep this world safe. But we shouldn't jump ahead without really focusing on what we achieved so far. Changing tax reform has taken more than 3 decades. The average family of 4 will save more than $2,000. Small businesses are going to have the lowest rate they had in more than 40 years. America is going to be competitive again now that we have the corporate rate down. Look what we did for the VA. We made landmark reforms there. The GI Bill is no longer only 15 years or you lose it. You have it now for a lifetime. We gave our troops the largest pay raise in more than 8 years. And when you look at the regulation, only one time in history has Congress ever been able to use the Congressional Reform Act to repeal regulation. We did that 15 times. And then when they sit back and want to evaluate this president, I never heard anybody talk about the stock market, so many records going forward, or getting growth back to 3%. I thought last year was a good year, but 2018 is even going to be better.
It would help move the agenda if you can get some Democrats on board, certainly in the Senate, but why not in the House as well? I asked Michigan Democrat Congressman Debbie Dingell about possible areas of common ground. Take a listen to this.
Infrastructure is one issue that I think, and it's not just roads and bridges and potholes, which are in very bad shape, but we should have broadband across this country. I've said I'll work with the president on trade. I'll work with everybody and anybody to get pension legislation through. That's my job.
So she's highlighting trade, infrastructure, and pension reform. Any thoughts on that, Majority Leader?
We can work on that, but as we walked through on the tax plan, I had a number of Democrats individually come up to me, tell me they liked the plan, they were going to vote for it. In the last days, they came to me and said that they were getting whipped from their own leadership that would not allow them to vote for the bill. We need to be able to break this logjam, to be able to work together, find common ground. And that's one thing I watched this president do many times. Remember, it was just a couple weeks ago when Nancy Pelosi wouldn't even come to the White House to meet with the president when it came to government funding. And right before we left, we watched that we had to have a vote to keep government open. Nancy Pelosi whipped her own Democrats to vote no to try to shut the government down. I hope in the new year they have a new attitude.
President Trump has said he wants action on DACA early in the new year, those children brought to this country illegally. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says the Senate should take action sometime in January. What about the House, sir?
Well, I think the president is right. Remember why we're in this situation. That President Obama did something that wasn't legal in the process. Really, it's the House and Senate that in our Constitution has to legislate. But the president brings up a very good issue when you talk about DACA. We've got to secure the border so we don't have this problem in the future. He's talked and campaigned on building that wall. And then when we looked at the recent individual that tried to create a suicide bomb in New York, think of how they came through that chain migration. If we can fix chain migration, get the security along the border, I think we could come to common ground that everybody could agree upon and solve this problem, and I'm hopeful we can get that done this year.
Some of your House Republican members have expressed concerns about bias, perhaps with some at the DOJ, at the FBI, even with Robert Mueller's investigation. Where are you on all that, sir?
Well, the integrity of law enforcement is paramount. But it needs to be carried out without any politics or any bias. But I understand the frustration, because when you sit back and you look at what has happened, the lack of response, Congress has a responsibility of oversight. They have been ignored. They have been delayed. They have refused to send people in to have hearings or to be questioned. And then when we look at the latest of people being removed that are in centerpieces from investigating when it was Hillary Clinton or making decisions on what investigation should go forward, when you look at the Inspector General as the individual who came forward and found the emails, and these individuals saying it's their insurance policy wanting to determine what happens in politics, we cannot allow that to happen in a country that believes in the rule of law. And that's why I think people are frustrated, and rightfully so.
What is your take on the Robert Mueller probe at this point, and are you hopeful it'll be wrapped up soon?
I'm hopeful it gets wrapped up very soon, looking at what they've gone through, but I'm interested in what Congressman Devin Nunes and the Intel is looking at as well. Remember, there are a number of investigations going on here, but the lack of cooperation, the questions that have been raised by some individuals working in the DOJ and also within the FBI, and the Inspector General doing that own investigation where these emails came out forward, I think we're going to have to clean some areas up, and I think you have to have transparency.
Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy joining us live from California. We thank you for your time, sir. See you back here up on the chilly Capitol Hill in the new year.
Well, thank you, and have a happy new year.
Thank you, sir. Up next, a look at ISIS on the move and a deadly reminder that terror is still a very real threat around the world. Today, a horrific reminder that the fight against terror is not over as dozens are killed in a suicide blast in Afghanistan's capital. White House officials say President Trump has been briefed on the terror attack and continues to monitor the situation. The blast is one of several recent attacks from a growing threat taking hold in the country. Senior Foreign Affairs correspondent Greg Palcott reports.
Death and destruction again in Kabul, Afghanistan. A suicide bomber blew himself up in a packed Shiite Muslim cultural center. Other bombs detonated outside. All told, some 41 killed and 84 injured, including students, women, and children.
When the explosion went off, we escaped from the room where we were. We saw the smoke and flames. We went to help. When we got there, the situation was very bad.
Claiming responsibility for the attack, the Afghanistan offshoot of ISIS. As the terror group recedes in Iraq and Syria, it is growing in strength in Afghanistan. The Sunni Muslim extremists often targeting Shiites. They also target Iran. Iran-friendly media was based at the center.
They are killing as many Muslims as they are anybody else. So they're targeting Shiite mosques. They're targeting fellow Muslims.
ISIS attacks are only complicating the U.S. fight in the country. It was already challenging with al-Qaeda and then the Taliban in the wake of 9/11. 16 years later, and the Trump administration is doubling down, with U.S. troop levels back up to around 14,000.
I believe with all my heart that Afghanistan will be free and America will be safe, and we'll win this fight.
Increasingly, American troops have the dangerous ISIS in their sights. The terror group, along with the Taliban, was targeted in nearly 2,500 operations in the last 6 months involving U.S. Special Forces. Bombing runs by the Air Force are 3 times last year's pace, and often, according to officials, ISIS are the ones getting it. But the number of ISIS fighters, again according to officials, remains steady at around 1,000. Holding ground and holding global attention.
They like the headlines. So as they gain, that helps them gain more favor with followers. We're now here fighting the oppressors in Afghanistan, or the U.S. presence there.
The gathering hit today by ISIS in Kabul marked the anniversary of the then Soviet Union's failed occupation of Afghanistan. Reminder, perhaps, of how difficult it can be for foreigners to tame the demons in that country. Mike.
Greg Palcott reporting on America's longest war. Greg, thank you. Taming the demon, as Greg said, is extremely difficult. U.S. military officials said this week that ISIS has lost 98% of the territory it once held. But as Lucas Tomlinson reports from the Pentagon, the terror group remains a threat.
Despite ISIS being nearly destroyed, its remnants now pose a new threat to thousands of U.S. troops still on the ground.
They seem to be moving with impunity through regime-held territory.
Some of the remaining fighters seen by U.S. drones fleeing west to land controlled by Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. But a general leading the coalition says coalition jets will not pursue ISIS fighters in parts of Syria controlled by the regime and Russian forces.
The Syrian regime has failed to demonstrate its ability to prevent the resurgence of ISIS on their own soil.
It's just one of a host of challenges left in the wake of ISIS's downfall. Russia cited the ISIS threat when it deployed dozens of fighter jets and thousands of troops to Syria in the fall of 2015. Then President Obama predicted a quagmire ahead for Moscow and Iran, Syria's other backer. But more than 2 years later, there are no signs of the Russians leaving. Russia's defense minister says his country's 2 bases in Syria are now permanent. In ISIS, both Iran and the U.S. found a common enemy. With that threat now on its heels, some Iranian-backed forces in Iraq are now turning their attention to the U.S. by threatening the more than 5,000 U.S. troops in Iraq and 2,000 in neighboring Syria. In a candid admission, the CIA director put Iran's Quds Force commander on notice, reaching out to him personally.
What we were communicating to him in that letter was that we will hold he and Iran accountable for any attacks on American interests in Iraq by forces that are under their control.
The consequences of a diminished ISIS and emboldened Iran could pose a threat to a key American ally in the region.
About 80% of Assad's fighters are Iranian proxies in Syria. To establish this kind of land bridge over into the Mediterranean. And so what we face is the prospect of Iran having a proxy army on the borders of Israel.
Another challenge post-ISIS is rebuilding Mosul, Iraq's second largest city. That was all but destroyed. The UN estimates 40,000 homes need to be rebuilt, keeping millions languishing in refugee camps, the kind of desperation that led to the rise of ISIS in the first place.
Even if we defeated ISIS as a name, we have to remember that we are fighting an ideology, not just an organization.
The Iraqi government estimates it's going to take $100 billion to rebuild, but it's not clear right now who's going to foot the bill. Tonight, more than 3 million Iraqis are living in refugee camps. Mike.
Lucas Tomlinson live at the Pentagon. Lucas, thanks a lot. Up next, a bitter and deadly cold grips the Northeast. Welcome back to Special Report. We're glad to have you tuning in tonight, especially those of you in the northern U.S. who are probably staying inside as bitter cold temperatures take hold. Senior correspondent Mike Tobin reports from Chicago on the dangerous deep freeze and when we can expect a little warmth.
More than 5 feet of snow dumped on Erie, Pennsylvania. Cars buried in snow. So bad that people there had to go old school with the shovels when the snowplow got stuck. Take a look from the satellites. Most of Lake Superior, Lake Erie, and Huron have frozen over. It is the icy wind whipping over Lake Erie that picked up moisture and dumped it from Ohio to New York.
Our crews have been out 24/7. That's really hard to keep up with this amount of snow.
From Boston to St. Louis, weather advisories are in effect due to the frigid air. International Falls, Minnesota, the self-proclaimed icebox of the nation, set a record low with a temperature of 37 below. Hibbing, Minnesota broke a record for cold that stood since 1964. In Chicago, city officials have set up warming shelters for the homeless, who are particularly vulnerable to hypothermia and frostbite.
We have outreach teams that, again, will go engage them, pick them up, and transport them to shelter.
Doctors who treat frostbite say the other at-risk population is people who don't take the cold weather seriously and fail to wear proper cold weather gear. Frostbite can set in under 30 minutes.
Really quickly, the pain goes away and they don't feel anything. That's why frostbite is so bad. The sensation goes away, and at that point in time, you really don't know that you're being frostbitten until it's too late.
The cold weather turned beautiful in Minnesota as the Minnehaha Falls froze. People climbed behind them to get a one-of-a-kind look. Park rangers warn of the dangers not only of slipping, but falling ice. It's also illegal to climb behind the falls. In Green Bay, Wisconsin, the Ray-Nitsky Bridge on Main Street got stuck partially up. Drivers were detoured and crews were sent out in the cold to get it working so tugs and ships could come and go. Then a frozen span on another bridge stopped boat traffic. The bad news is that there's more cold air coming down from the north. It'll keep these frigid temperatures around well into the New Year's. In fact, it's going to be about 2 weeks till we make the transition from brutal winter to plain old winter. Mike.
Our Mike Tobin in a freezing Chicago. Mike, thanks, and go back inside. Another good day on Wall Street. The Dow gained 63, finishing at a record high, the 71st of the year. The S&P 500 was up 5. NASDAQ jumped 11. Democrat Doug Jones will be sworn in as the next senator from Alabama in the new year, despite Republican Roy Moore's refusal to concede the election. Alabama Secretary of State made the results official this afternoon, even after Moore filed a complaint claiming voter fraud in the election. Moore fought accusations of sexual misconduct with teenage girls from decades ago during his campaign. Moore said he has passed a polygraph test that proves his innocence. President Trump made cracking down on illegal immigration a big part of his agenda, and new numbers could help bolster his argument to get something done. National correspondent William LaJeunesse reports from Los Angeles.
For decades now, U.S. immigration rules have been based on an outdated system.
A system the president wants to overhaul next year. A new report prepared by the conservative-leaning Center for Immigration Studies, based on census data, promises to help shape that debate.
Everybody wants to come to the United States, and quite frankly, the United States can be choosy about who it admits.
The report shows in 2016, an estimated 1.8 million legal and illegal immigrants settled in the U.S., the most ever in a single year, and 53% higher than just 5 years ago.
So the real debate now is, what should legal immigration look like? And I'll make you a prediction: in about 5 or 6 weeks, we're going to have to deal with that as you start to face the DACA expiration.
Reasons cited by the report for the jump in President Obama's last year: more guest workers and foreign students, virtually no interior or worksite enforcement, a surge in Central American women and children, and for the first time, spouses of visa holders were allowed to work, encouraging those still overseas to join new immigrants already here.
Family immigration has a huge multiplier effect. 70% of all immigrants, according to the White House, in the last decade have entered through family family-based visas, and we're seeing the effects of it today.
This graph shows where immigrants are coming from. Comparing 2005 to 2015, Mexican immigration is cut in half, from 400 to under 200,000. Central Americans up by 100,000. Asian immigration almost doubled, and twice as many immigrants from Africa and the Middle East. From Europe, that immigration was flat.
What you really need to do is understand what is the undocumented population and how we fix that problem, and then reach over to those who are coming in legally and say, how do you maximize the benefit to your new home country, the United States?
The drop in Mexican immigration was dramatic. However, it also means the U.S. is deporting fewer Mexicans. Wednesday, the Mexican Interior Ministry said President Trump removed 26% fewer Mexicans than Obama in 2016.
Now, this report doesn't take a political position, but with the economy growing and the birth rate slowing, Congress may be more concerned about who emigrates to the U.S. than how many. Mike?
William Lajeunesse reporting from Los Angeles. William, thanks. Earlier this year, California's wine country faced incredible devastation as wildfires ripped through hundreds of thousands of acres, destroyed thousands of homes, and took the lives of dozens of people. But tonight, a region hit so hard is on the mend. Senior correspondent Adam Housley reports from Napa.
It's strange, but we know we're going to rebuild, and we know it's going to be a nice building again, so we have faith.
Winemaker Pierre Bierbin says he has hope as he looks over the spot where Signorello Winery once stood. The October wildfires destroyed this winery and raged through wine country, killing 42 people and burning down nearly 9,000 structures.
It's important for people to come back because we depend on tourism, and the valley is still beautiful and it's still a good time to visit.
We do need to put people back to work. We do need to make sure that our wineries, our restaurants, our tourist industry, this beautiful land is supported by the people who really care so much about it.
One of the top 5 most visited areas in the country, the 2 weeks of fires came at the region's busiest during harvest season. And while 22 wineries were either damaged or destroyed, there are more than 600 others in Napa and Sonoma that are open for business, albeit with more room than anyone wants.
Most people are very surprised. They're expecting to see charred areas, burned areas, and they're few and far between.
There is destruction here. In Santa Rosa, thousands of homes gone, families' lives changed forever. But much of it in residential areas, affecting people who are more dependent now than ever on a steady income, most likely tied to the tourist dollar.
There's been an immense amount of support from family and friends and just the community in general.
The best way that anyone interested in supporting Napa Valley right now would be to come visit.
While the Thomas Fire in Southern California also this fall is now the state's largest ever, the wine country fires are the most destructive in history, with estimated damages into the billions. While Signorello Winery hopes to reopen here in 2 years, they need to be creative to keep all their employees working, and they're now taking wine tasting directly to people's homes and, of course, hitting the road to sell their wines around the country. Other wineries doing what they can to reconnect as well to change the perception that Napa and Sonoma burned down, because bookings in the wine country are down 50% from last year. Mike?
Our Adam Housley in wine country. Adam, many thanks. A year in review, a look back at some of the successes of the Trump administration in 2017 when we come back.
So the country is really, it's a big, beautiful ship that we're turning around. When the individual mandate is being repealed, that means Obamacare is being repealed. It is time to exit the Paris Accord. The war on coal. The Keystone XL pipeline. We don't want to forget DACA. The Trans-Pacific Partnership. Completely one-sided deal with Cuba. The rogue regime in Iran. Jerusalem is Israel's capital. Christmas is back bigger and better than ever before. Merry Christmas, everybody.
It has been quite a year. Let's bring in our panel. Daniel Halper, contributing editor to the Washington Free Beacon. Amy Walter, national editor for the Cook Political Report. And Molly Hemingway, senior editor at The Federalist. Ladies, gentlemen, good to see you.
Thank you.
Molly, your thoughts, first year highlights?
Yeah, Yeah, it was a good year for President Trump, a rough year, but he ended really strongly with the tax reform and tax cuts. I mean, I think a lot of people didn't think he could accomplish this. He's a political neophyte. He did it with a very slim majority in the Senate and with a media establishment that was content to not really be that truthful about what was in the bill. So that's really good. On foreign policy, he took a new direction from what we've been accustomed to with the previous couple of presidents and actually managed to crush ISIS. It's not that he had a totally different strategy than President Obama, but he enabled his military to actually make the decisions and be accountable and do what they needed to do to get it done. And he saw a lot of success there that we didn't see under the previous administration.
Amy, did you notice a learning curve as the year went on? And what are your observations of year one?
Well, certainly, I think by the time we got to the tax bill, the relationship between the president and Congress had gotten a little more balanced. It was obviously a little rocky during Obamacare, but I also think that was the issue set. I think it's a lot easier to get Republicans on the same page on tax cuts than it is on something like Obamacare in its many different facets, including Medicaid. Look, if you go through the list of accomplishments, many of which you included in the setup package here, the president fulfilled a lot of the things he said he was going to do on the campaign trail. The challenge right now for the president and his party is that voters, at least at this point, aren't giving credit to Republicans. They don't see that this is they don't see him particularly positively. They don't see the Republicans in Congress in a popular light. If you look at just at where voters think they want to be in the 2018 election, Democrats have a double-digit lead at this point. So given all the accomplishments and how well the economy is doing, the real question is, why isn't the president or the party doing better? And a lot of that is, for as much as he's succeeding in keeping his base energized, he's double energizing the opposition. Right. And swing voters, a lot of these things that are appealing to conservatives aren't necessarily appealing to swing voters. The big challenge, I think, for 2018 is Republicans selling their most major piece of legislation, which is the tax bill.
You mentioned the economy. We have some handy-dandy graphics we can show you about economic changes this year. Real GDP growth, unemployment rate, consumer confidence, all improving between January and now. And then look at the Dow milestones. Look at the curve at that. Anybody with a 401k at home certainly recognizes the impact in terms of the surging Dow. We'll see if that continues into the new year or whether we see a bit of a reversal. Daniel, is one of the keys looking ahead perhaps that voters feel like they're getting something from the tax cut? They see that in their paycheck every week?
Sure. Obviously, I think that would help, right? If people actually can feel the benefits of it, I think that does help in many ways. Look, President Trump so far has been the most conservative president in the first year of my lifetime, which might not say that much, but it is what it is. But I think the problem is many of his accomplishments have not yet been lasting. So he has a Supreme Court justice. He has reshaped in many ways the judicial system with a lot of nominees in lower courts, helped along by the Senate. And of course, he's had this tax reform package. But a lot of the other changes have been basically rollbacks of President Obama's, which conservatives rightfully cheer and they celebrate. But it doesn't mean that the next president has to abide by that. The next president can come back in and re-sign a lot of these things and go back to where President Obama had. So unless he can get Congress, unless he can get legislative accomplishments, I think how we judge in terms of substantive policy of this administration, how we judge that, I think is still up in the air.
Because as we saw with President Obama, the pen and the phone didn't have lasting impact unless the pen was writing on permanent legislation, right?
Correct.
And I think that is a very important point to pick up on in terms of the rollback versus the new stuff. Plus the president has made this presidency, this first year of his presidency, really about himself. And voters are really also saying that this presidency has been much more about his personality than about the policies. In fact, if you look at polling where they ask people both who like him and don't like him, what it is that they do or don't like about him, the number one thing that comes up are aspects of his personality and his temperament. That wasn't true for Barack Obama, where they picked his policies. I don't like Obamacare, I don't like foreign policy.
But it was true that Obama's presidency was also very much about him, and it worked very well for him. At the same time, it didn't work out very well for the Democratic Party writ large. So I think that is a challenge also for Republicans, is to figure out how to work with this president, how to make sure that their success is also tied to his. And I think this tax reform and the tax cuts really showed a way for that Tea Party element, the more populist element, to work with the establishment Republicans. If they can do more of those kinds of successes, working together, they might both benefit.
And my sense is that with a Supreme Court justice being approved, if there's another Supreme Court opening at some point, that would be something that his base could get very excited about.
Right, and that was one of his most successful things that he did. He got such a good reception. Donald Trump got such a good reception to that pick. You can pretty much count he'll pick someone else along those lines. At the same time, it's also true that some of these regulatory changes really are far-reaching. I mean, dismantling the Clean Power Plan, the Paris Accord, and all that bureaucratic stuff that goes along with that. I mean, had that not happened, you would have really gone down in one direction with environmental regulation overreach. That didn't happen. And so I think some of these things are more long-lasting than people realize, even though they're just repeals of things Obama did.
We've seen a fair amount of personnel shuffle in the first year. We will see if that continues into the second year or whether things stabilize a bit at the White House and throughout the Trump administration. Panel will be back in just a moment. Next up, the biggest assets and liabilities in the president's cabinet.
I know I speak on behalf of the entire cabinet and of millions of Americans when I say congratulations and thank you.
I also want to thank all of the members of the cabinet, and I think we have a fantastic team. And next year, we're going to go on to really some amazing things. The members of the cabinet, you've been outstanding.
And with that, we're back with our panel. Time for a look at the Trump cabinet assets and liabilities. Let's go assets first. Daniel?
Well, it's always hard going into that cabinet room. We don't really know what they discuss and who's in charge and whatnot. But as far as the public face, I think it has to go to Nikki Haley, the UN ambassador, who has, at least recently, really been a force for good, I think, for the Trump administration, persuasively making the case for American power and helping at the UN, helping get support for American initiatives. I know it wasn't perfect with the vote last week or the week before in terms of condemning the Jerusalem decision by Trump, but in terms of sanctions for North Korea, in terms of substantive things that she's gotten done, I think has been impressive and certainly a boon for.
And before we get hammered on social media, the White House website does list her as a member of the cabinet. So,
yes. As the UN ambassador has been in previous administrations.
Absolutely.
Amy,
I concur. That is a cabinet level. I picked Jim Mattis, who is in this town. There are very few things that both sides can agree upon. This is one that all sides seem to agree they have a great deal of faith in. He also was pushed through the Senate. He got his confirmation. Sorry, I couldn't think of the word confirmation. He made his confirmation through the Senate. It was not unanimous, but it was pretty darn close to that. I think there were only 1 or 2 votes against him. And even when you talk to folks who don't have a lot of good things to say about Donald Trump, they point to Jim Mattis and say, I feel very good knowing that he's sitting there in the cabinet.
Yeah, a lot of folks on both sides feel good about the generals.
Yep.
Molly, your asset?
Yeah, one of the things that people really talk about with this first year is how well things are going with the stock market, consumer confidence, the economy doing well. And a lot of that has to do with President Trump's general desire to pull back on regulatory overreach. He had had a pledge that they would have they would get rid of 2 regulations for every new one they passed, and it's actually turned out to be something more like getting rid of 20 regulations for every new one passed. The biggest player, the biggest, most important person for some of this stuff is Scott Pruitt, the EPA head. And this is a guy, it was a courageous pick for Trump to pick him. He has done just amazing work. He fought for getting out of the Paris Climate Accord treaty. That was not a done deal. He had to fight with Jared, Ivanka, Rex Tillerson, all these people who wanted Trump to stay in. And that's just one of many environmental regulatory overreaches that he has been able